Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum's Winter and Spring series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take some questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We tend to have more questions than we're able to address. So if you could try to ask your question in a concise manner, I would really appreciate that. We'll take about 15 or so minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we do have a social media channel on YouTube. To access it, please see the icon at the top of the website. This talk is being recorded and will be posted shortly afterwards. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org, and I mean that. I always love feedback. Now, more importantly, to this afternoon's speaker, Phil Craig, who is joining us from London. And for those who may not be aware, London goes to daylight savings time, or I guess I should say springs forward tomorrow at 2 a.m., unlike in the States when we went forward a few weeks ago. So I want to thank Phil for catching that and making sure he's here on time because I missed it. But more importantly, Phil is a best-selling author and multiple award-winning filmmaker. He studied history at Cambridge University, was a BBC graduate trainee, and built his career working for iconic British TV series World in Action and Panorama. Later, he held senior positions at the prestigious Book Lapping production company, at Channel 4, at the Discovery Channel, and at ABC Television in Australia, where he ran the entire factual output, including his high-profile Anzac Centenary project. Throughout his TV and writing career, Phil spent many years researching and reinterpreting the story of Britain and its empire during the Second World War, including his definitive and best-selling account of 1940 Finest Hours. He now runs the Scandalmongers podcast with his friend and fellow writer, Andrew Lowney. Today, Phil is going to discuss his latest book, 1945, The Reckoning, War, Empire, and the Struggle for a New World, which offers a global cross-examination of the historical forces at play in the final year of World War II. Reviews have been absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to cite a few from the Sydney Morning Herald. That 1945 is an epic canvas, ambitious and in some ways even Tolstoy-esque. On both the narrative and thematic level, this is skillfully told history for the general reader. While Mark Dappen from the Australian writes, engrossing, good natured, and perceptive, Phil's style is conversational, but never glib or shrill. His judgments are often understated, but extremely shrewd. And finally, Professor Hocking from Monash University writes, Australian readers in particular will be alternatively enthralled and enraged by 1945 at the naked exercise of imperial and commercial power in our region that the author reveals in the final months of a war we were told was from liberation and self-determination. And I would certainly concur the book is a unique perspective on the final year and the aftermath of the war. And I'm thrilled to have our speaker today. And with that, Bill, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Gregory. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And hello to everybody. I can't see anyone, but if you're there, welcome and thank you. And a general introduction, I guess, to me and my work. I did spend 40 odd years in television, so I only managed to write about 5 books. But the trilogy that I began in 2000 was with the book Finest Hour. And I guess it's my view, my interpretation of Britain and Britain's empire in the Second World War. Of course, it covers a lot more than that, and Britain's all-important alliance with the United States and its relationship with the Commonwealth, especially Canada, is critical throughout. But the focus is primarily Britain and Britain's empire. And when I came finally, after 20 years, to write the final volume, a couple of years ago, 1945, The Reckoning, the empire was very much in my mind. A lot has happened to those of us who write history in the last 20 years. Thoughts about colonialism, about how it represents the story of empires and imperial heroes and villains, very much part of the conversation all around the world. Which statues should we pull down? Which should we keep up? Should we feel pride? Should we feel shame? What should we feel about our complicated imperial legacy? And those thoughts were very much in my mind. I'm making this sound like a really serious, heavyweight political treatise. It's not. That's not my style. You'll see James Holland's name there. James is a good friend. I'm sure many of you will know him. He's a very successful British popular historian who claims that my original book inspired him, which makes me feel proud but also rather old. But he wrote a very nice foreword to this particular book, 1945, in which he talks about my style and what he says is the ridge line for sort of main, middle brow, popular general historians, the ridge line between presenting compelling personal material that holds the attention of the audience and a fresh and invigorating and interesting analysis. Too much personal material, it gets a bit folksy. Too much heavy politics and strategy and theorizing, it becomes like homework, and we don't want it to be homework. So he thinks I managed to hold that ridge line, and I hope I do. Certainly I try to. So yeah, Britain and its empire. And one thing about Britain and its empire that really motivated me throughout this three-book journey actually is that there is a strange tendency, certainly in this country, to think of the Second World War as a story of Britain as an underdog. Clearly, the events of 1940 are central to that. Britain standing alone, facing possible invasion, defeat in France, bombing, the Blitz, we're rationing, we're plucky underdogs. Yeah, but are we really? That's not quite how the rest of the world ever saw Britain. Certainly not before 1940, and actually increasingly not afterwards as well. So if you just change the focus a bit onto British strength and Britain's depth of personal and economic resources, primarily from its global empire, its unprecedented large merchant fleet, and of course the Royal Navy, then Britain doesn't appear to be quite such an underdog after all. And of course, we're coming into the Second World War after 20 or 30 years of very high profile agitation, campaigning, and soul searching about the very nature of empire, especially in India, which is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the largest in terms of population, economically very important, and very high profile Indian politicians had campaigned for independence. They've been met with a certain amount of repression. There've been violence, been executions, there've been riots. The thing had just about held together, but it was a cause. It was a great international cause, especially in North America. If you were young and if you were liberal and if you were progressive, you believed that empires were old-fashioned and washed up. You believed, for example, and this is certainly what President Roosevelt believed, that the empires of Britain and of France had made a very big contribution to the global recession, the Great Depression. So empires were seen to be controversial, and a whole generation had arisen in Britain's colonies that was very keen to see the British leave. Now, when war comes, that creates a really big dilemma for many people. And I wanted to spend a good part of this book, maybe half of it, looking at India, which I found fascinating because I'd never really studied it before. And I tried to do it through the story, because I like to tell my stories through personal testimony. So I like to hinge and hang my thoughts and my analysis around real people. I chose two for India. One is this gentleman, Colonel Subhas, perhaps the greatest Indian fighting colonel, brigadier, and general of the 1940s and 50s, known at the time and to history as Timmy, Colonel Timmy, General Timmy. Fascinating man, loved learning all about his life. He grew up as a young, well-educated Indian from a well-to-do family with great connections to the military. He wanted to be a soldier. He joined the British Indian Army. This was an army that was 80, 90% Indian, with about 10% British, usually as the officers. Some lower ranks were British too, but the officers tended to be white British. That was changing through the 20s and 30s. He was part of a generation, actually, they called it Indianization, who was moving up through the ranks. And he was clearly marked out as a very talented young officer. But he believed in independence quite passionately. And that led him into a very complicated and fascinating internal debate debate with himself. He sees the good of the British in India. He sees very efficient relief. For example, there's a terrible earthquake in 1935, and he's part of the relief of that. He fights against sort of brigands and raiding parties from Afghanistan, and he thinks the British Army does a very good job holding that situation down. But he sees the bad. He sees the bad. He sees the arrogance of some of his officers. He sees the mistreatment. He sees the prejudice. He sees lots that's wrong with the system. And at one moment, he actually thinks of leaving because he's going to be ordered to take his men into the streets to confront protesters. And some of these protesters are people he knows and politically is sympathetic to. And he goes to meet the Nerus. Yeah, the Motilal Nehru, the father of the future prime minister, becomes a friend of his. And they talk, and he bears his soul to this man. And he says, Timmy, don't leave the army. We need men like you to learn about armies because we one day will soon hope to be independent. We will need people like you to provide the architecture, the infrastructure of a new India. So he stays. But it's hard for him. When war breaks out, he's very torn. In a minute, I'm going to speak about another Indian army, the one that allies itself to the Japanese. And Timmy's own brother, who is much loved by Timmy, decides to break his oath of allegiance to the British Raj, to the British Crown, and join the other side. So you can see he's at the center of all sorts of very complicated forces, but he does decide to stay loyal. And I wanted just to read, I'm going to read a few passages from the book, the sort of lighter stuff as well as the more serious stuff. One of the reasons Timmy is so loyal to the British Indian Army, he just loves it as an institution. He had a lot of fun, as officers did. Here they all are, a mixture of white and Indian officers. That's in the late 20s, I think, early 30s, tiger skin rugs on the wall. It was quite a good life. And it was a colourful, sort of slightly eccentric institution, as well as being a very efficient military one. It was said at the time that the main preoccupations of the white British officers of the Indian Army were pig sticking, tiger shooting, gin drinking, and adultery. It had that sort of reputation. And I just wanted to read you a little section just to give you a flavour both of how I write my books and of this man and his time. By the mid-1930s, Timmy was based in Quetta, serving on the famous northwest frontier, the region that porously divided India and Afghanistan. It was a classic imperial policing role, and here, in between dealing with bands of tribal warriors, he witnessed the Indian Army engaging in one of its favorite pursuits, sexual scandal. A friend of Timmy's from a Sikh regiment, another newly Indianized unit, was caught having a love affair with the wife of a fellow officer. She was white and he was not, which led to much grumbling in the clubs and the officers' mess. The grumbling had nothing to do with sex. There were plenty of enthusiastic adulterers active in the community. In fact, a group of officers and their wives were openly organizing events using the regimental notice board that today we'd call swinger parties, and nobody seemed to care very much about that. Timmy's own commanding officer, when a captain, had deserted his wife to live with the wife of a junior officer, who had then himself moved in with the captain's abandoned partner. The four of them still remained in the base, enjoying these unconventional relationships, although the women would sometimes snarl at one another after a heavy night in the club. You can get a good sense of this and of the openly promiscuous culture of the army by looking at some of the rather remarkable questions it set for its own officers. This is a genuine exam question if you want to get promotion in the 1930s. You are Captain Pio de la Faca of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Thrusters, and your arrival to your commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel E.M. Bracer, for the affections of the frail but fascinating Mrs. I. Lovett. Mrs. Lovett has informed you that her husband is away for the summer and she will be travelling to Missouri. Before answering this question, please be aware that Lieutenant Colonel Bracer is A, of a somewhat jealous nature, B, furiously jealous of your success with this lady, C, convinced you are a rotten officer. And D, aware you have already had more than your share of leave. For the examination, please write a one-page letter applying for 2 months extra leave to see her in Missouri. So yeah, that was the Indian Army. He loved it. He was helping change it. It was a great life, and he made many dear friends. And had a few girlfriends as well himself. But when war comes, of course, he has to decide what to do. He does stick with the army. And I opened the book with quite a serious account of perhaps his greatest victory. This is an amazing battle at the very beginning of 1945. An amphibious operation down the coast of Burma, part of General Slim's 14th Army's remarkable campaign. Many people think it's the greatest victory over a Japanese army of the entire war. And this force, which is 80% Indian, just does extraordinary things. And at Kangor, which is a little sort of coastal community, Timmy's men fight alongside British commandos, and they achieve a really remarkable victory. And it leads to this passage, and I wanted to sort of build up this sense that it was both a successful, multiracial military operation, and yet above and beyond all of that, this issue of empire still lingered and was going to affect everything, as it does throughout the year and throughout this book. So I'll read you another little passage here. While Timmy helped drive the Japanese back in Arakan, British and Indian military engineers threw a 1,000-foot-long Bailey Bridge across the Chinduin River to help Slim push into northern Burma, the longest such bridge ever constructed. I had asked for the impossible, Slim said, and got it. The confidence and momentum of 14th Army at the beginning of 1945 was down to a stunning all-hands effort that threw up new barracks, depots, roads, railways, pipelines, airfields and hospitals at astonishing speed. All of this took the enthusiastic collaboration of hundreds of thousands of men and women, the colonizer and the colonized, the white, the black, and the brown. But that's not the complete story of Burma in 1945. Tens of thousands of Indian soldiers would soon stand on the banks of the Irrawaddy, the great river that bisects central Burma, all poised to fight. However, not all of them took their orders from Bill Slim. A substantial number were members of the INA, the Indian National Army, and they were there to risk their lives for the cause of a free India in alliance with the Japanese. The nation in which they were fighting also contained many thousands of people who had volunteered to resist the British in the hope of creating an independent Burma. And this was itself a microcosm of a region in which popular sympathies were very much divided. Millions of Burmese, Malays, Javanese, Borneans, Sumatrans, and others had been delighted to see the Japanese sweep the British and other colonial powers out of their lives a few years earlier. The cruel stupidity of the Japanese army had by 1945 alienated a large proportion of them. And indeed, as Timmy fought in Arakan, the key Burmese nationalist group was poised to swing back to the British side. But that did not mean that a reconquest of the old colonies would be in any way welcome or popular. For all his pride in his men, for all his comradeship with the commandos he'd fought alongside at Kangor, Timmy knew these things better than most. That's why his perspectives and the choices that he makes are so interesting. And that's when I introduced the idea that he's troubled with his conscience. He's refused to take his men into the streets to suppress protesters. He does believe in independence. His own brother has joined the other side. And as I say, the more you research this period and the military history of what's happening in Burma, the more you realize, well, you realize something quite interesting about history itself. But first of all, you realize it's a story of two Indian armies. Timmy's army, those guys on the right, amazing 2.5 million people, the largest volunteer army in history. And they were all volunteers, whatever they thought of the British Empire. 2.5 million volunteers across all the armed services. And they were remarkably successful. But in modern India, they are not particularly well celebrated. And the guy on the left, he is from the other army, the Indian National Army. And he and his mates are the subject of a recent 10-part Amazon Prime series, massively popular in India, which presents an extremely one-sided and very, very sentimental and over-the-top account of their battles. And I found that so interesting. So I dug more into it and into the man who inspired and led, didn't lead them at the beginning, but led them at the end. Subhas Chandra Bose, his life and Timmy's life, they intersect in all sorts of great ways, which as a writer is so lovely. So I can intercut them and their different perspectives. Bose, like Timmy, grew up as the son of a wealthy, successful Indian family. They're connected to the Raj, to the British. They have a very good living in administration, in law. Don't forget, the British ran India with only about 2,000 white civil servants. The rest were Indians. And many of them were sent to the top British universities. Bose himself goes to Cambridge. Timmy was sent to Sandhurst, which at the time was seen as one of the greatest military colleges in the world. Sort of West Point of Britain, Britain's empire. So Bose is like Timmy. He's interested in independence, but he gets more and more radical. He becomes a thorn in the side of the authorities. He agitates, he marches, he joins the Congress Party. He's a contemporary of Gandhi and Nehru, and they're all friends at first. But as the years go on, he becomes more and more messianic, more and more fascinated, in my opinion, with the glamorous era of the great dictators of Europe. And don't forget, at this time, a lot of people were thinking like that. We all now, well, now today, we look at people like Stalin and Hitler as historic villains. At the time, it wasn't so simple. These people had lived through imperialism, global economic calamity. Capitalism wasn't working. Empire wasn't working. What would work? Well, in Europe, there were these new models, men of action, paramilitary societies. He was very interested in Stalin, how is Stalin, whatever the cost of human life, Stalin transforms the Soviet Union in the matter of a decade or so. He's interested in Hitler too. He gets more and more into this idea of being perhaps himself the savior of his country who could transform it at the head of a paramilitary state. And he drifts more and more away from constitutional politics. And eventually people like Nehru and especially Gandhi fall out with him. They call him a demagogue, which I think he probably is. But he was very successful. He toured the world. He was on the cover of Time magazine. You know, had he stayed within the tram lines of normal political life, he could easily have been the first prime minister of an independent India. As it is, when the war began, he flees to Germany. He turns up in Berlin, throws in his lot with the Nazis, meets Hitler, hangs out with very senior Nazis. He's a real coup for the Germans because his propaganda he broadcasts 2 or 3 times a week, encouraging Indians to resist the British and to use this opportunity to ally with Germany to sweep the British away and to finally take their independence. And he's very good at it. But, you know, the choices he made were very stark. He visits concentration camps. He's personally friendly with 2 of the people who attend the Wannsee conference, which is where the Holocaust is sketched out, is decided. He is actually confronted. He's confronted by some of his old friends because he's a man of the left. And there's a great quote. I shall find it. It's a very short one, not a long reading. He learns. He's in there. He's in Berlin in 41 and 42. People are hearing about what's happening in the East, what's happening to the Jews in Poland and in Ukraine and in the Baltic states. And many of his old Indian comrades are troubled by this. And he just settles on a formula, which he uses time and again. We will not say anything either in favor of or against what the Germans are now doing in the lands they occupy. For what they do there and what they do throughout Europe does not concern us. Our cause is just. We need their help. That was his view. There's Timmy on the left. Another man who believes in independence takes a different view. So they are at loggerheads, and the men will end up fighting each other. And this is just an example of, you know, where Bose goes. Here he is at the with Tojo, the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. He throws in his lot with Hitler. Then he travels to the Far East, takes command of the Indian National Army, speaks. He even goes to Nanking. And if you know anything about that story, and I'm sure many of you do, it was the site of the most dreadful massacre and atrocities, perhaps of all time. And everybody in the world knew what had happened at Nanking, what the Japanese had done to Chinese civilians. Well, he goes to Nanking as a guest of the Japanese and speaks about pan-Asian values in a place where one group of Asians had brutally massacred another. And not like in hot-blooded battle, in weeks of sustained sadistic horror. And here below, here, Indian prisoners being shot by the Japanese. The Japanese didn't give Bose much help. They behaved pretty foolishly and stupidly, even when he offered them all sorts of military assistance. This is in 1944, the great Japanese offensive that leads to the Battle of Kohima and Imphal. Chow Delhi, onto Delhi. Bose's men are part of that. His best fighters join. He's convinced that as soon as his real Indian army meets Timmy's army, which he calls mercenaries, that all the British Indians will immediately come across to his side and join him, and they will march to Delhi. And it just doesn't work like that. There's some of his propaganda on the right. Join us to kick the British out. On the left is what actually happened. The Indian army stayed loyal. And like Timmy, a lot of people, whatever they thought of the empire, decided that they would rather see an independent India come from beating Japan. Timmy at one point says, we cannot build a new nation out of Japanese bayonets. And repeated Japanese atrocities towards Indians and others didn't help Bose's cause. So he was militarily humiliated, and whenever his men came into battle, by and large, they lost. They lost badly. But here's something I came across that really made me think. This is a quote from Salman Rushdie, the great Indian writer and novelist. This is in Midnight's Children, his great book about independence. Something does not have to be real to be true. And in the India of today, Bose, and there's his statue, is seen as the architect of independence. The Prime Minister Modi is forever praising him. And there are schools and colleges. If you fly to Calcutta, his hometown, you'll land at the Subhas Chandra Bose International Airport. He's everywhere. Whereas the guys on the left, the people that actually fought the war and then went on to provide the infrastructure for the new independent nation, as Timmy had always wanted to do, they're sort of forgotten. Not exactly forgotten, but certainly amongst young people, if you go online and engage in this debate, you'll be swamped by young Indians saying Bose was a hero. He believed, no matter who he allied himself with, he believed in independence. He fought for it. The people in the British Indian Army, they were basically colonial lickspittles and mercenaries. I think it's very sad, but that is why history can be annoying. Here we are. History is annoying. There's Modi literally paying homage to a massive statue of Bose, the great hero of Indian independence, according to him, and I'm afraid many other people in that country. Not, I should add, members of the Indian Army, who I've come to know, some of whom actually are related to Timmy. I think the Indian Army still feels that the right decision was made by most people during the war. But in the country at large, and it's a big country with many people, Bose is revered. And I find that, fascinating. Now, still just within reach. These are the last 4 words of my very first book, because then those people were just within reach. I met lots of veterans of the Second World War when I wrote Finest Hour 25 years ago. Of course, for this book, real living veterans are few and far between. But after it's published, I gave a talk at Hampton Court, not far from where I live. And I came across this amazing man, Yavar Abbas. He's 105 years old. That's his new wife sitting on his right, Navi. They got married 5 years ago, and he was 100 and she was 80. He came to my talk, and it was just extraordinary to meet him. Some of you might remember there was a celebration of VJ Day, what we call VJ Day, the end of the war against Japan. And King Charles, our King Charles, addressed a lot of people from the various services. And Yavar was there, and he stood up and spoke. And he spoke very movingly about his love for Britain and for India and for what he'd done in the war, and also the fact that he'd had cancer. And of course, King Charles had cancer, and King Charles cried. And it was a beautiful moment. And there, anyway, he turned up, and I got to know him. And it turns out this man lives 5 bus stops from where I'm sitting now, in a place called Feltham, just up the road from where I live, which is astonishing. And he, not only had he fought in the army, he'd fought for Timmy and knew Timmy and had played bridge with Timmy. Timmy was quite a formidable character. Yavar said playing bridge with Timmy was almost as scary as being under shellfire with him. But he also absolutely bought into the idea that I tried to encode in this part of the book, which is that they did want the British to go, but they didn't want the British to go in this way, through these means, with these allies. He tells a lovely story, actually. I will not swear, but here I'm making a speech. I get upstaged by a 105-year-old. He tells a story that I think catches the moment. He said, we were at this dinner, and it was stinking hot. And our colonel, who was a reactionary old red-faced bore, white, obviously, got up and he said something very offensive to the young Indian officers. He said, oh, God, what a terrible day, the weather and the flies, and I can't wait till we get out of this effing country. And Yavar, who was only 21-year-old junior officer, felt he had to say something. So he stood up and said, on behalf of all the Indians present, sir, we can't wait till you get out of our effing country too. So I thought that was lovely to meet him. And yeah, living connection to the story that I was telling. I really did enjoy that. Now I'm rushing ahead. We're up time. Okay, it's a bit more time to go. I will rush forward a bit. As I say, I like to tell stories through people and witnesses to history. And I came across this amazing woman, Angela Noblet, who was a nurse, a British woman, young woman, early 20s. And she was sent out to India and Burma. And she saw the independence movement. She personally witnesses the Bengal famine, which is a big part of the story. It was a disastrous famine, which the British spectacularly mismanaged. I mean, it really is astonishing that so many Indians stayed loyal after all this stuff. But she's just a great, great witness to history. And she wrote in such a kind of very beautiful, thoughtful style in her diaries. And nobody, I mean, she'd privately published them in the 80s, but she wasn't really well known. So it was a great, for me to fall upon her as a source. And as I said to my wife a few times, I think I might be falling in love with this woman who I never met. She wrote beautiful things. I'll just read you one passage. She was an idealist. She thought that India should have its independence, a better world was possible. And she just catches, I think, the atmosphere of that time and the hope of that time. And I said, I don't want this book, I never intended this book to be a political lecture. I wanted to weave the real experiences of actual people. And she was so modern in her attitude, I kept having to check that these really were her words written down in the 40s and not something that she'd written 20 or 30 years later, but they were. At one point, she works on this amazing river boat, where she's one of the few white people. As I say, Indianization is taking over. So a lot of the doctors, she's a nurse, a lot of the doctors and surgeons and other nurses are increasingly Indian themselves. And she's on this riverboat, which is like a hospital ship. And they sail up and down the Brahmaputra River. And she has experiences of love and loss, great drama. She deals with all sorts of tragedies and burns victims, and it's very moving. And she experiences treating people with cholera. But she also loves it. She kind of just really falls in love with the people. I'll just read you a couple. I've got time, I think, another little section of colour. Angela was proud of her nursing on the river and enjoyed seeing weak and desperate men transform under her care. There was a shortage of qualified doctors, so Indian licensates, partly trained medical staff, worked on the steamer too. One evening, as a soldier with cerebral malaria was slipping into a coma, one such young Indian man had a crisis of confidence and held back from administering the intravenous quinine that Angela knew from painful experience was this soldier's only hope. As we stood there looking at the patient by the dim rays of a kerosene lamp, it suddenly dawned on me that he'd never given an intravenous injection before. I took his hand, encouraged him to try, and we saved that boy's life. The calmness and camaraderie of days and nights on the river touched Angela deeply, as did the friendships and romances she witnessed between men and women of very different races, faiths, and backgrounds. Her hand on that of the nervous young doctor, wheeling around the deck in her sari in front of her cheering friends, reciting Urdu poetry up towards the stars, all of it combined into a vision of a better world, an antidote to the inequalities and abuse that she'd witnessed. In her diary, late one night, perhaps after one of her moonlit dances on deck, she sat down and wrote, "Ahead of us curves the moon, a single thread of light flanked by a single star, which proclaims to the Muslim world the advent of Eid al-Fitr and the end of the long fast. The sky above me is a lucent indigo, drawing its light from the increasing stars. Like the new fire of Easter in the Western world, this festival speaks to me. It speaks of a fresh start, of a victory, but also of hope and trust and a good shared future." Isn't that beautiful? I love that section. So, empire, the future, change. Lying above and over all of this is a political conversation about that future. And a lot of it comes down to this rather remarkable document, one of the most important documents of the 20th century. This is written and signed by Roosevelt and Churchill before America is formally in the war. And it's part of Churchill's offer to America to get the help, the economic help that Britain desperately needs, and the sort of philosophical, political, morale-boosting support that only America could give. And we should not forget, Roosevelt was an anti-imperialist. The New Dealers around him, they were all men of the left. In the 30s, they had railed against empires. So in the Atlantic Charter, Churchill is made to basically commit to a new future of self-determination. And this document, which electrifies the world, I mean, right across the British Empire, people read this and go, oh my goodness, things really are going to change in all the colonies all over the world. And it is a very important document. The words in the document become part of the United Nations Charter not many years later. But did Churchill mean it? Well, I wonder if he did. There was a bit of backsliding. And I'll quote again, even while negotiating the charter, Churchill cabled members of his war cabinet using language that he doubtless did not deploy in front of Roosevelt, writing, "We must regard this as an interim and partial statement of war aims, designed to reassure all countries of our righteous purpose, and not the complete structures which we will build after victory." As I crafted the document, quotes, "I primarily had in mind the states and nations of Europe under the Nazi yoke, and it is not my intention," quotes, "that the natives of Nigeria or of East Africa could sooner by a majority vote choose the form of government under which they live, since prior obligations require to be considered." Well, he'd signed something that basically said the opposite of that. And he'd done it for political reasons. Time is rushing forward. I won't do any more quotes. I wanted to move to one section of the book that I hope is relevant, particularly to America, and connects to the Atlantic Charter and the story I've just told. I was really surprised to find out what happened in 1945 in Vietnam, or French Indochina, as it was known. As I mentioned, Roosevelt was a certainly had been diehard anti-imperialist, particularly critical of the French Empire. And as late as March 45, according to Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial Staff, his diaries, Roosevelt is adamant the French mustn't be given back Indochina. You know, and as part of that, America has a mission. The OSS, as you all know, I'm sure the forerunner of the CIA, has a mission in Vietnam, in China, and their ally, the man they've chosen to work with, is Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh guerrillas, trained by Americans, helped by Americans, working with Americans on targeting and supplies. And there's a political conversation and a lot of positivity. Ho Chi Minh had been to America, admired America. Yes, he was a communist, but he was quite a pragmatic communist, or at least he was then. That's what the OSS believed. So much so that when they came in September to draft, when Ho Chi Minh drafted the Declaration of Independence, he drafted it in the company of his American friends. And look what the first line says. It's a direct quote from America's own Declaration of Independence. He was writing letters to Washington. He wanted to be friends. The OSS was saying, he's got a good organization. He's very popular, especially in the North, but also a little bit in the South. We should work with this guy. He wants to be friends. But Roosevelt's dead. Roosevelt has died. Truman is now in power. And also there's a looming kind of sense that there's a Cold War coming against communism. And Truman is different to Roosevelt. And for whatever reason, and it's still quite cloudy, Truman basically lets the British and the French do what they want. Oh, here we are. There's an American OSS officer at the actual Declaration of Independence in Vietnam. So years later, when the America's fighting in Vietnam, a lot of these documents are found, and the Washington Post puts them on the front page. People find it hard to believe that America was once very favorable to Ho Chi Minh. Anyway, de Gaulle and Churchill get together. They're both old imperialist war horses. They don't want the age of empires to end just yet. And de Gaulle especially really wants to get the empire back because of glory. He hates the humiliation that France has suffered under occupation. So they send an army, a French army, under this guy, Leclerc, one of the heroes of the liberation. And here he is on the left with some soldiers, but he's not come to liberate anything. He's come to put the French back in their palaces. And he's using mostly Indian army soldiers. His private instructions say, you are going to go to Indochina to secure the future of the white race. I wonder how those Indian soldiers would have thought about that if they'd known. There's a battle. It's all very nasty. Ho Chi Minh can't believe it, but they end up fighting and they're driven out of the south eventually. Then the British leave. But one aspect of this, and I will stop fairly soon because I realize I'm running out of time, that astonished me was that because the fighting against Ho Chi Minh was so difficult, the British decided they needed extra reinforcements and none were available. So they released tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war. We're talking October, November 1945. What's the story in the world's press? People staggering back from these camps, emaciated figures, revealing stories of brutality and massacre in prisoner of war camps and railways, Australians, British, Americans, others. And yet, some of these soldiers, who knows what they'd done, are given rifles and sent into battle under British command against Ho Chi Minh, who had been the ally of the West only about a month earlier. It completely poisoned everything. And I think it's fair to say it set the scene for many, many more wars to come. Were they necessary? They may have happened anyway. It's not for me to say, but it set that whole relationship up in a very bad way. And as you know, the French fight a war, and then there's another war, and America finds itself drawn in, as is Australia. There are other things I would say, but I think in terms of the politics of the book, that's quite a good overview. I do go on to talk about many achievements that Britain did. I try to tie the fact that some of the more cynical calculations were inescapably linked because life is complicated and power is complicated. Britain couldn't have done some of the great things it does in 1940 or indeed in 1945 without its empire, without a certain amount of realpolitik and toughness. So neither underdog nor overdog, doing its best, still a massive contribution. I describe my books as a love letter to that generation. I'm not saying there's anything wrong in the victory. Of course I'm not. I'm just saying if you like your history, warts and all, you need to understand that the imperial agendas, and I talk about other places too where this happens, Indonesia, Borneo, imperial agendas meant a certain backsliding from the promises and the promise of the Atlantic Charter. And that's something people just need to know if you want to understand what really happened, rather than just a sort of warm bath of nostalgia. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Gregory, for indulging me.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Phil. I think we already have a few questions. Jim and then Mike. Jim, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh yeah, well, that's I love that story about the Lubbock. That was great. The little test in the Indian Army. That was funny. Um, and I enjoyed End of the Beginning. I just read that a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, thank you.
And I was reading it in conjunction with a whole bunch of books on the North African campaign in preparation for a project I have. And I could see your experience as a filmmaker in reading that book because there were parts of it where I said, Jesus Christ, this is like visual. I'm like visualizing the Ghazala campaign. I'm visualizing the route into Cairo. And so I could see the influence of your writing or I don't know how you and Tim collaborated, but it came out very clearly in that book. I recommend that book to people.
Thank you.
Now, let me just get into, the story you just read about Vietnam. To American audience of my age, we're very familiar with this, unfortunately. And it raises the question of the awareness in the history writing in general about the decolonization period of the war itself and the conflict with nationalist movements that happened during World War II. I remember when I began to explore all this, I saw specialist studies done in the 50s about nationalism in the Philippines or nationalism in Indonesia during the war, but it was not something that creeped into the major narrative of World War II. That narrative was essentially United States fought the war, beat them in Normandy, D-Day, dropped a bomb. We had a problem with the Pearl Harbor, and the Brits, of course, have their own set of mythologies. And now we have this coming into the picture with you, and I'm sure you did a great job introducing these very important subjects to hear about. And sometimes I see people going all the way over to ignoring the traditional forms of understanding World War II and just basically emphasizing colonization, nationalism, fighting against imperialism, and stressing that as the whole subject of the war. So how do you think, and looking at what we're going through right now with this crazy war in Iran, how do you think how do you sort of read the consciousness about the war with these kind of issues you're raising, which I think are so important to raise?
Gosh, that's a massive question. I mean, one thing that really surprised me actually is, and again, it sounds slightly sacrilegious to say this, is that when the Japanese sweep through the Pacific and Southeast Asia in 1941-42, for so many people of that region, it's a thrilling moment. We know how badly they behaved, and to so many of the people. But it was a thrilling moment, and that genie was never going to go back in the bottle. People realized they didn't. The white man could be driven out by people who looked a bit like them, and that they didn't necessarily need the control of these Europeans or Americans to kind of build a modern society. In terms of what's happening today, I mean, I think in some senses we're returning to maybe more of a sort of a Yalta era, aren't we? Where the sort of the 4 or 5 powerful men sit around a table and carve things up, and the people who are actually on the ground, like the Ukrainians, for example, are sort of excluded because they don't really matter. I mean, maybe it's always been like that. Great powers do what great powers do, but it certainly feels like it's ever more explicit. But anyway, I do hope for the best in Iran, like everybody else. Fear the worst, hope for the best.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's a really interesting. What are you going to work on next?
Well, funny enough, I'm sitting here surrounded by books about U-boats. So I'm writing another World War II book, but much more narrow, about a single week in a convoy, which is also the story of a love affair. So
Ah,
that's my
very
next
good.
project.
Very good.
Thank you, Jim.
That's going to be an interesting marketing, an interesting roadshow. That book, that should be very fascinating, Phil. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, I'll ask the traditional question first. Can you hear me?
Hi, Mike, I can.
Ah, great. Good. I have two questions, actually, as I actually normally do. But the first question has to do with Bose, because it seems to be that the idea of the means justify, or the end justify the means, excuse me, is becoming very much more in vogue today, but obviously has always been there. And it seems as if the that even if the means to the end means embracing the even some of the qualities of the enemy, or some of the ideas of the enemy, and that could be brutality, racism, or whatever. In the case of Bose, in India today, he's very, again, he's much more popular than perhaps he ever has been. But what are their feelings about his alliances? Do they see it as a necessary means to an end, which I think you suggested, that allying himself with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan? And what was Bose's attitude towards that? I mean, did he support, for instance, the German and Japanese racial policies, etc., or was he repelled by them to any extent, but just saw it as the alliance as a means to an end? That's one question. Sorry, it's so complex. The second one is, as far as the empire, the British Empire, I mean, the idea of Indian soldiers fighting for the British Empire, but they were also fighting under officers like Slim, who was not to the manner born, so to speak, and did not seem to embrace the more colonial ideas of Britain. And there were a lot of Brits that that saw the empire more as an empire of ideas rather than an empire of colonies. Do you think that was a factor in the Indian soldiers fighting for Britain, essentially, but also for India? Do you think that was a factor in the success and the enthusiasm of the Indian Army? That's two actually separate topics. They're a little interrelated.
Okay, well, sorry.
No, I apologize for if they're not quite as clear, but if you have any questions about my questions, I'll clear it up.
In terms of Bose and ends and means, I think as time moves on, it can be quite favourable to extremists. We've seen something similar in Ireland. I was lucky enough to cover as a journalist the peace process in Northern Ireland that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And at the time, young people were so passionately excited, and young writers and musicians, the idea that these communities could come together, and it was so wonderful and inspiring, and it was cool, and that all this killing would stop. Now, 25, nearly 26 years later, 7 years later, young people are getting into the IRA again in Ireland, and pop bands and rap artists. And it's, oh yeah, up the IRA, well, it wasn't that great. Because if you don't have to live in the time of these people, it can be reduced to like a football slogan, a tribal chant, our side against their side, especially in the age of TikTok videos where you get your emotional history hit. And I think something similar with Bose. If you had to live with him and his effects on the world, as someone like Timmy did, you formed a view that actually, on balance, it isn't the way we should go. And we'll compromise with the British, despite the bad things the British are doing. We think that's the best way to go for a reasonable outcome for everybody. But years later, because he was so indefatigable and so focused on one thing, he's a very, very easy sell in a short attention span age. And I think that's partly why he's so popular now. His own attitude, it's hard to know. He kept batting this stuff away. He went to the Andaman Islands. There's a part of India, it was the only part the Japanese took, the Andaman Islands, off in the Bay of Bengal.
Yeah.
And he goes to do a speech, and it was written up. He pulls up the flag. He raises the flag of an independent India. He says, for the first time in 250 years, free India. And it's newsreels and everything. He goes away. 2 weeks later, 50 of his own people are summarily executed by the Japanese over some very obscure argument. The Japanese commander just thought that they were possibly traitors. So had them all shot without any process. And this was the members of the party of his ally. And he didn't even complain about it. He just let it pass. I think he was so fixed, eyes on the prize, independence. Whatever happens, even if it's his own men being killed, it wasn't going to divert him from that. And I think another reason why he is remembered so fondly is he died a very good time for his legacy. There was no trial, there was no paper trail, there was no kind of international publishing of all his papers and what he said about the Holocaust, for example, and the concentration camps. He dies within, a couple of days before the end of the war. And so it's quite easy to valorize him. In terms of Slim and the British and the Indians, it's a funny love-hate thing. Timmy, there's a great scene in the book, actually, an interrogation. One of Bose's own top lieutenants, Singh, wrote down afterwards the details of his interrogation with the British people that capture him. And in the end, they end up crying and hugging. It's extraordinary. This joint love for India that they have, even though they just fought a war against each other. There is a kind of weird fondness. And I think it's probably reflected in the fact that India today is still quite friendly to Britain, despite what Modi says about Bose. It's not just cricket. There's a whole load of cultural ties that people seem to want to keep. There was a softer side, a cultural side, a literary side to the empire that was, separate to policemen shooting down demonstrators on the street. Anyway, that's a long, rambly answer. A shorthand way of saying it's very complicated.
Well, I don't think it was rambling at all. Bloody good talk also. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Gary,
Cheers.
and then we'll do Aaron and probably close out with Garth. Gary, if you want to unmute your line, it's yeah.
Yes, thanks for an interesting presentation. So the one political event that's sort of famous during this period of time is the Cripps mission in 1942, which I can't say I really know that much about it, other than it seems like more about Churchill trying to get rid of Cripps in the short term and politically in the long term than make some real political accommodation with Indians. But do you think there was any sort of initiative? I mean, I guess on the one hand, it seems like the Indian Army actually fought pretty well when they were well led and equipped and such. Do you feel like there was any sort of real accommodation that could have been made politically with the with India during the war that would have helped the Allied cause? And also, what were the immediate post-war political developments? How did did you go into how these Timmy and others perceived? Obviously, India got its independence, quote unquote, fairly quickly after the war, but it wasn't immediate and it wasn't trouble free, obviously. So what did they think about what did they just have done compared to what political developments came about right after the war?
Well, the Cripps mission is really important and interesting, and it arrives because a lot of it depends on success. Success breeds success. So at the beginning of the war, the Indian Army is doing really well in North Africa, and it's really popular. There are parades. There are newsreels, cigarette cards. People are thrilled. There's a sort of surge of patriotism. And that explains partly why so many people volunteer to join what looks like a winning cause. Then as soon as Japan enters the war, it's a total disaster. The British lose Singapore, they lose Burma, and there's all sorts of terrible stories of racial prejudice. The British evacuating the white people from Rangoon, making the Indians walk like 700 miles through kind of dangerous, infested swamps and mountain ranges. And then later there's the famine, of course. Cripps comes at that moment. And Gandhi famously says, Cripps is offering us a right, a check on a crashing bank. You know, because Britons no longer have that sort of sense of power. You know, for all of Britain's faults, it was powerful. It made things work. Timmy always thought it was efficient, the Raj. You know, India needed something like that. But if it's just failing left, right, and centre, what's the point of us? Let's just kick them all out. So that's when they launched the Quit India campaign after the Cripps mission, which is ruthlessly repressed by the British. And yet, despite all of this, so many of these people remain loyal, which is still a question that I can't really give you a definitive answer to. Although maybe what happens after the war helps illuminate that. You mentioned partition. The Indian army splits, of course. Timmy has to divide his own units. So the Muslims go to Pakistan, and the Sikhs and the Hindus mostly stay with India, and the units that were Gurkha are split. And yes, Timmy ends up fighting in those early wars in Kashmir against men who he had served with. It's very tragic. He's actually quite popular in Pakistan, though, because he leads this one particular, you know, when they were slaughtering people on trains, Timmy does a lot to save lives. So he's quite popular in Pakistan, even though he's a major Indian general. His relationship to the Brits, it's so funny. There's a lovely story at the end of the book, you know, where his first regiment, where he first began, was a Scottish regiment. It was like the 1920s. And they write this lovely letter to say, as you know, we have leopard skins for our drums in the regiment. And given that we seem to have lost most of the places in the world where leopards live, we wondered, could you shoot some for us? Since you used to be an officer in the regiment. And he's thrilled. And even though he's chief of the staff of the Indian Army, a rather important job, he goes off and he gets the leopard skins and sends them to Scotland. So yeah, like I say, that residual affection was always part of it. So yeah, another rambly answer, but good question.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I think, Andrew, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, you should be, I'm sorry, Aaron, I apologize. Aaron, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can, Aaron. Hi.
Oh, great. Oh, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful book. I work in IT, and I've gone to India dozens of times since the mid late 90s, and I have lots of friends and their parents and so on. And Bose, who they call a Netaji, you know, a revered leader, is like almost like a god, especially if they are on the BJP side politically. Can you maybe talk a little bit, because there's this really crazy conspiracy thinking, which we only tend to identify as, obviously people in the West do conspiracy thinking, but that's not true. Where his crash, you know, his death in Taiwan, they view as some kind of, you know, malicious act, etc. And then he was flying with the Japanese vice admiral, who were flying to Manchuria to conduct talks with the Soviets for surrender. And there's this very interesting dynamic to this day where the Japanese army is still revered, and even German Nazis in India, and Netaji Bo is buried in Tokyo at the Buddha shrine, which is you know, the most revered shrine for warriors in all of Japan. So there's a really interesting dynamic there that to this day still reveres sort of the Axis in a part of Indian life And I'm wondering how much of that did you experience? Because through my friends and their parents that are like say they whatever a third of them that are BJP supporters, uh, he's basically a god to them. It's pretty fascinating.
Well, actually, in his own lifetime, I mentioned he was slightly messianic. He saw himself as a warrior prophet. There was a religious, a spiritual side to him and his writings. He writes these long treatises about relationships and love and sex and all sorts of stuff that would normally be considered outside politics. So he saw himself as a prophet, I think, as much as a political leader. And when he died, there were so many stories, and they went on for decades. And it's a bit like when any really famous person dies, there are people who love and revere them so much they don't want to believe it. So there were stories that he faked it, and that was very popular, that he actually escaped to Russia. And he'd done this before. His life story, I only touched on it in my talk. It's full of the most wonderfully dramatic escapes. The way he gets out of India by escaping from house arrest, traveling across the whole country, crossing the border in disguise, and then when he comes from Europe to Japan, he travels in a submarine, which gets involved in a battle. I mean, his life is amazing. You can see why people really, revered him. It was like a sort of action hero, come prophet, come failed military guru. But yeah, everything around Bose, even now, is special. It's magical. Like I said earlier, he's an easy sell. I can totally understand it. Obviously, most of my friends are people who write military history or are in the army, and they tend to be rather skeptical of him. But as you found with the people you've come to know, and it's certainly true online, you really can't say anything against him without getting absolutely squashed. And the idea is that you just don't understand. And I have to say, as a white Englishman in my 60s, they were oppressed, they were colonized. He stood against that. I completely understand why he would be revered, but I would also argue that people like Nehru and Gandhi and yes, Timmy also stood against it in a more humane and pragmatic way, would be my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Garth, we'll close out with you if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi,
Hi, Garth.
Phil Greggs,
Phil Craig.
Professor Phil Greggs. I'm part of NIMAS also that meets also. But here's my question. My grand uncle in World War II for Jamaica fought for the RAF intelligence. I don't know what level, lower level, I suppose. He just went to high school, but he's very intelligent. And he eventually went to accounting school, university in England. But I have a question. This is my question. Why isn't there much more information about the Sikhs, the Indians, the Middle Easterners, the Africans, the Caribbeans in World War II, and especially in intelligence? That's my question. The OSS in America never hired African Americans. The English hired Caribbean Americans if they're smart enough, if they're college able. But I don't get it. There's no information. There's no information, military history about this. That's my question.
Well, it's an interesting point. There's actually been quite a big campaign, certainly in this country, for more recognition in terms of museums and memorials to the many, many Caribbean and obviously Indian and African people who've served right across the war. And I mentioned that little story of Kangor. There are some Kenyans who fight there, who fight really well and get all sorts of medals. And one of them ends up in the Mau Mau. So just to show you how conflicted people were, they fight for the British, but they also are thinking, dreaming of independence for their own country. And within a few years, they're fighting against the British back in Africa. I showed you that picture of that amazing guy. He's Muslim, Yavar Abbas. But I was actually doing this talk to a Sikh group of military history enthusiasts who gathered together. And, the Sikhs were just the most incredibly successful fighters. And also, as you say, served in intelligence and in all sorts of other operations. But in terms of the warrior instinct and success, of Indian Army. You have to put the Sikhs at the top. And no, they don't get enough recognition. They absolutely don't. And that campaign doesn't. People think the Japanese were defeated primarily by America in the Pacific. This, of course, is true. But the land battle that chews up such a big part of the Japanese army in that final year, a lot of it takes part in Burma, and a lot of it is done by not only Indian soldiers, but Indian officers, increasingly so. So thank you all. I appreciate very much you joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Garth. And that concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is 1945, The Reckoning, War, Empire, and the Struggle for a New World by Phil Craig. Please join us in 2 weeks on Saturday, April 11th at 1 p.m. when historian David Holland will discuss his book, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, the Pivotal Battles of the Mate Nicao. Sure, I mispronounced that. But he lived there on Guadalcanal for 3 years, so it's a fascinating book, and he really knows the subject well. Thank you for joining again this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing everyone at our next talk. Until then, take care.
I will say good evening from England.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Phil, it was great to have you. We hope to have you back on the next one. Sounds
My
great.
pleasure. All the best, guys.
Take care.